We're going to work on closures today. So closures are things that help you close the openings on your garments when you put them on. If the garment doesn't have stretch or give to it, you have to have some way to get into it, and especially if it's particularly tailored or fitted, you're going to need a way to undo and do it. Now, by machine, we have zipper, and we're going to look at that, but most of the other closures that you might use are going to be done through hand sewing. I've got a variety of closures here, and we're going to have some of them be required for your project. Some will be extra credit. I have here 3 different buttons. So this is a 2-hole button. It's a 4-hole button, pretty self-explanatory. And then this one is what we call a shank button. So instead of having the 2 holes on top, you've got this little part in the back here that's called the shank, and that's what you sew through. Shank buttons give you the opportunity to have more decorative buttons because you won't have that visible thread going through, so you're not limited on the face of the button by having those holes there. So that's why you would have a shank button. And all buttons come in very different sizes. You can have super tiny ones, you can have very large ones, and anything in between. So a button is combined with a buttonhole. Pretty much every closure has 2 parts to it. And like I said, there's the button and the buttonhole. We'll deal with buttonholes when we're working on the vest. You can do buttonholes by hand. Most often we do them by machine. But for this project, we're just going to work on the button part. There are also snaps. Snaps we are pretty familiar with. And snaps we still use gendered language to describe the 2 sides when you order snaps. You can just order a set of snaps and it's going to have both sides, but you can also order just one side or the other. This side, which if you look, it's very flat, and then it has the raised part that snaps into the other part. This is the male snap. And then this one, if you look at this one on the side, it's a little more rounded, and it looks like it has that extended part, but that's where the receptacle side is. That's what the other side snaps into, and this is known as the female side. So, and snaps function, by just inserting those parts together, right? So when we sew them, we want the male side to have the flat part down, and the female side, you want to have that curved part with the receptacle up. So when they're on the fabric, they're like this. Now, sometimes it can get confusing because when you look at the back side of a female snap, it can look kind of like a male snap. The way that you know it's different is if you turn it to the side and see how rounded it is. So you compare the two. The male side is very flat when you look at it from this side, and the extended part is more prominent. Then we have hooks and eyes, or hooks and bars. This guy is known as a wire hook and eye, and that's because it's simply a piece of wire that's been twisted into this shape, right? The hook, that you often see this at the top of a zipper. The way this functions is your eye, and sometimes your eye is flat like this, and sometimes it can be a loop, but the hook just hooks through that eye, and so you need tension to make that function and work. And then this guy is a skirt hook and bar. So as you see, it's a bit larger, it's much flatter, and so that is what you often see at the top of waistbands on pants or skirts, and that's why it's a pant or a skirt hook and bar. And this is a bar, and not an eye. So like I said, an eye tends to have a loop or be rounded. This is a flat bar to accommodate this larger, flatter hook. All right. Now for your project, your 2-hole button, your shank button, the snap, and the wire hook and eye are going to be your required elements. The 4-hole button and the hook and bar, are going to be the extra credit. I will also demonstrate how to make a thread loop. Sometimes at the top of zippers, and especially in older garments or maybe nicer garments, instead of having a wire hook, they'll use thread to create a little loop that the hook will then go through. So that's what we're going to work on today. So I'll put these aside. And we'll get started with buttons. How about that? Now what I want you to do is you're going to take your 6x6 square and we're going to fold that in half, because most often you're working through multiple layers of fabric. Now if you're putting a closure on the side of the garment where the back side from the closure is going to be the outer part of the garment, then you're going to not sew all the way through. But we're going to be working on this as if we're working on the inside of the garment, and so we are going to sew all the way through both layers to put the closures on today. So I've got my thread here, and you want to get out enough thread so that you can have a nice, so you don't have to like stop in the middle and make more and rethread your needle, because that just will take extra time and can be a little annoying. But you also don't want to get your thread too long, because what will happen is then you will end up knotting your thread and having to undo it, which you might see me do as a part of this process. We'll find out. But you need your thread, you need your hand sewing needle, and if you're older like me, you're also going to need some reading glasses. I don't have them located, so we'll see if we can do this without. So what you want to do, and I talked a little bit when we talked about the sewing machine, we talked about the fact that a freshly cut end of thread is most likely going to go through your needle more easily, the eye of your needle more easily than a rough cut or frayed part. You can also choose to moisten the tip of your thread. I'll do it often by just licking my fingers and just pulling the end of the thread. You can also, some people also just stick the thread in their mouth, which I used to do, and I just kind of switched that for some reason. And then what you want to do is you want to look at the eye of the needle, and you're going to take that end of the thread and thread that through the eye. The closer you are to the end, the stiffer your thread is going to be, and the easier it should be to get through the eye of that needle. Well, isn't this exciting to watch? All right, they have self-threading needles where you can just kind of slide them into a slot, but that doesn't, I get a little uncomfortable with those, because then there's a little top part on the eye that can catch in your fabric. So once you get that through the eye of the needle, we're going to be using a double thread, which means we're going to pull the thread so that we end up with both ends fairly even. And then we're going to tie a knot in this end. You can tie a knot however you want to. You can just, physically tie it with both hands. Another option is there's a way you can do it where you wrap around your finger and you just kind of roll them together, and you may have seen a grandmother or an aunt or someone that you know who sews do that. The way I like to do it, I will lay the needle and the thread, with the thread I'll lay the needle on my finger, put the thread on top, and pinch those together. Then what I do is I wrap the thread around the needle about 3 times, and then I'll just and have that between my fingers, and then I'll just pull the needle through and hold my fingers there. And what should happen is as that pulls through, it should make the knot, but my thread was being uncooperative. All right, I'm not sure why that didn't work, but we're going to try it again. All right. Fairly even ends of the thread, lay it on top of the needle, pinch them between your finger, Wrap this thread around about 3 times. Hold that between your fingers. Slide the needle and then the thread through. And then when you get to the end, you've made a little knot. I don't know why we're a little blurry. Okay, and then you want to trim your threads very close to that knot. And now, from here, we're ready to sew. And that's going to be the way you prepare your thread for pretty much every hand sewing project. Sometimes you'll want to use a single thread, and the process is the same, except instead of having both threads tied together, you'll only tie a knot in one side, and you'll have the other side just be shorter. You would use a single thread if you're using a very lightweight fabric and you're doing some type of hem work. You're never going to use a single thread on a closure, okay? I like to start, so if we're looking at this, we're going to have one side that will have all the closures on it. We would consider that the top of the fabric. I like to start on the top of the fabric. I will put my needle through, and then I'll come back up very close to that knot. And the reason I do this is because what this does is it puts that knot underneath your closure, so when you're wearing it, you're not rubbing on that knot and eventually working it loose. So after I do that, I will go in and I will take what I call just a tiny bite. You just want to barely get into the fabric. And as you pull that thread, you're creating a loop. And then I just pass my needle through that loop and continue to close down. And now I've created a second knot, which just gives me a little added security, which I like. Now for the button, I can start from here. All right, so what we need to do first is when you're doing the button, you're going to come from the fabric up through one of the holes. And then you're going to go back through, just go straight across through the second hole, and you want to come back in to the fabric very close to where you started. Now we're just going to pull that thread down. If it wants to twist, it's best to untwist it. And you'll just pull that thread through until you've got a single pass, a single loop going through the 2 holes of the button. Now we're going to repeat that. All right, come back up through the fabric, right? You're just going to go across the approximate width of the holes. You'll come up through one side and go back down through the other. I'm kind of angling my needle in toward the center, so I'm trying to come out in almost the same spot underneath, because you want to keep that pretty close together. Again, I'm going to come up from underneath, go through that hole. Aha. And sometimes this will happen to you. You'll get a knot as you're working with the thread. It's nice to use you might use beeswax or a thread conditioner. There's one called Thread Heaven that I often use, and that makes the thread a little waxy and helps to prevent some of these knots. But if you do get a knot, you just work that knot out and then you continue on. Okay. All right, so I've come up through, going across through the other one, angled in, so I'm about in the same spot, coming out on the other side. Now I've done 3 complete passes. That's pretty much my standard. I usually will do at least 3 passes, sometimes as many as 5 if I need it to be very sturdy, but 3 is usually a good thing to aim for. Now I need to finish this off. If I just cut this now, everything's going to come undone because I don't have a knot and I don't have anything. And as I said, I prefer my knots to be on the top side of the fabric under the closure as opposed to near the body where it can rub. So I'm going to come up one more time, and instead of coming through one of the holes, I'm just going to come up from underneath the button and not come out any of the holes. I'm just going to come out from under the button. Now to make it, and so we talked about how this is a shank button that has a shank on the bottom. A shank is also the amount of the thread between the button and the fabric. If you've got very thick fabric, you may want to look at using a button spacer, which lifts the button off the fabric a little bit while you do this process, so that when you let it go, there's a little bit more room between the button and the piece of fabric, so that when you put the buttonhole over and it's thick, it sits more neatly, and it sits better than it would if it's sewn flat, because when it's sewn flat it might be crushing that fabric. All right, so I've come up from underneath. Now I want to reinforce my shank here, because we don't want to have to sew closures more than once if we can avoid it. And the way I would do that is I'm going to wrap my thread around the thread underneath, which creates a loop, which gives me an opportunity to make another knot. And then I'm just going to collapse that down. Okay, and I do that twice. So you wrap the thread around the bottom, pass the needle through the loop, collapse that down. Now these are a looser knot. It's not the most secure knot. So before I finish, the last thing I do is I'm gonna make a better knot, and I'm gonna do that by taking just a little bite out of the fabric or the thread underneath there, just like I did when I started, and that creates a loop for me to pass my needle through, and then there's my final knot. Okay, and I like to finish by doing what we call burying the tail. So if you take the thread and go back in close to where you came out, and just travel through the fabric a little ways, when you come out, that's where you'll cut the thread. And that helps keep it, that way you've got a little bit of a tail that after the knot. So if you cut really close to the knot, then the threads might work themselves out and undo your knot. But if you bury the tail and cut away from that, that helps prevent that. And then if hopefully you're inside or in between the two layers, so that then that tail thread isn't poking out anywhere. So that's sewing a 2-hole button. The 4-hole button is very similar. You're just doing it multiple times because you have more holes. All right, just to do that knot again, needle, thread on top, wrap around 2-3 times, pull the needle through. Cut close to, but not on that knot. All right. So that's our 2-hole button. Now we're going to do the shank button. We're starting the same way. I'm going to go down through the fabric, come back up very close to that initial knot, take a tiny bite of the fabric, create that loop, pass the needle through, and we have a knot. Now the way this works pretty much the same way, except instead of coming out on top, we're just passing through that shank over and over again. So I'm going to go through one side, and once I get through there, I'm going to come down again. I'm going very close to where I came out. You're kind of thinking about putting your needle in at an angle. Again, if that's twisted, untwist it. And this one you wouldn't need a spacer. The shank acts as its own spacer. So not only does the shank button give you a more decorative button, but it's also good for very thick fabrics, because then you don't have to worry about a spacer in between. All right, I went in this side and came out this side. So when I come up, I need to come back up near the side I went into in the first place. Right, so again, it's pretty much the exact same pattern. We're just doing it underneath the button. Now I've got a little loop here on the back because my thread got a little knot and got uneven. So you can just kind of try to pull those threads out so you can get them back even, because you want it to be nice and neat and clean on both sides. All right, see, so now I've fixed that issue. All right, so I've gone through twice. I need to go through one more. So I'll come in underneath, or I've gone through, so I'll go down. And then I come back up on the side, this side of the shank, and pass through. Oh, and try not to get it stuck inside the button. There we go. All right, so that's my 3 passes. So now I've got to go back down to complete it. Now, since I've done my 3 passes, I don't need to, I'm not going to have any more passes. I'll just need to come up one side and not go through the shank. Now, if I wanted to, I could do that wrapping technique under the shank button. It's not as necessary because we do have the shank there. So you can just tie it off the way we have been, taking the little bite to create a loop. So that loop gets a little smaller, and before it closes, we pass our needle through. Okay, that made our knot. Now we're going to come into the fabric close to that knot and travel either underneath or between the layers, just away from that knot a little ways to bury the tail. All right, so now we've got our 2 buttons. So next we're going to work on the hook and eye. Starting in the top of the fabric, as per usual, go in, come back, little bite, make a loop through the loop to make a knot. That's how we start every one of these. Okay, now the hook needs to be placed so the flat part back here is laying flat on the fabric. All right, and I will usually just use my thumb to hold the hook part in place because we're going to be sewing through these 2 loops down at the bottom. I'm going to place my eye right next to that first knot that I made, or the loop, and I'm already on the top side of the fabric, so I'm going to come from the outside of that loop to the inside for my first pass. That's sliding toward the middle. It should be on the outside. Oh, we got a strange loop happening. Oh, well, that came right on off. We'll try that again. All right, I'm underneath, so I can come up on the inside or the outside. Come up on the inside. All right, so now I've started on the inside, so now I'm going to go to the outside. And there's my first pass. Now I'm going to travel just you can come up pretty much the same place in the middle, but as I come back to the outside, I'm not going to sew right in the same spot because I want to distribute it around this loop. So next I'm going to go just a little bit away from that to make my second pass. And some people will take the opportunity to make this a little more decorative. They'll put their stitches very close together and have quite a number of them. And that's fine because the more stitches you have, the more secure that's going to be, and the less often you'll have to replace it. I'm comfortable with you only doing 3 because that's kind of my magic number. I'm going to do 4 just because it kind of looks a little better, has a little bit better distribution of thread. Right, so I've got my 4 passes there. So now instead of coming up through that loop, I'm going to come up, I'm going to travel a little ways on the back side, traveling away from where I was, and come up through the hole in the other side. Now I'm just going to repeat that process. So since this is my fourth and final pass, now my next step is to finish that off with a knot, correct? And we know I like the knots on the top side, so I'm going to come back. You can go in the center. I think it's a little trickier, so I'm going to come on the outside of the loop. Take my little bite to create the loop. Pass my needle through, collapse it, and now I've got my knot done. So I'll put the needle into the fabric, travel a little bit away, bury my tail. So that is our wire hook. Okay. So next we have the corresponding wire eye. We'll start the same way. Knot. Come back. Little bite. Loop. Pass. Knot. Okay. Now again, I can start on I like starting on the inside. Since my thread's already on the top side of the fabric, I can just slide the eye through there. And now it's pretty much the exact same pattern. And again, you can do more passes. You just want to, the key for these, if you do 3 or more, you must do at least 3. I'm going to recommend 4, but you can do as many as you want. The key here is to try to keep them evenly spaced, so you've got good distribution of thread around that loop, so that you know it's secure all the way around and not just on one side. All right, so now I've done that side, so I need to do the other side. And sometimes what I'll do just to make it more secure is I might do a little knot on this side. I know I said I don't like knots underneath, but we're not going to cut this one. So next we're going to travel up, so we're coming out through the next loop. And then we repeat that process again. And I will come up on the outside to finish off. Do my knot, tiny bite, make a loop, pass through, collapse it down. And if you wanted to tie it twice, I certainly wouldn't be mad, because like I said, the more secure it is, the less often they need to be replaced. All right, so I've done my knot. I go in near the knot, travel away, and cut. Okay, so there we have our wire, hook, and eye. And the way this functions on the garment is that eye just slips through that hook slips through that eye like that. Some people, and if you wanted to do this you can, will stitch at the top of this hook so that it doesn't flop around. I've not found that to be necessary very often, so that's not something I usually do, but you may sometimes see people do that just to help that be a little more secure and stable. right, now my thread has gotten too short to do anything else. So I need another thread. Oh, I got that one threaded much faster. Okay, so now we're going to do the snap. Once again, start the same way, needle through the fabric, come back up, tiny bite, make a loop, pass needle, and collapse. So I'm going to start with the female side. So you want to make sure that when these are sewn, that they can actually function by inserting one into the other. So again, I like to start on the inside of that hole. And essentially, this is the same thing that we just did with the hook. It'd be nice if you didn't catch your snips with your thread. All right, so I come up through the hole. I go over the other side. And I repeat that at least 3 times. And I like to, you want to travel just a little bit for each stitch so that you're covering, since that's more of an oval, you want to kind of cover that expanse. Okay. Now for my next, I got a little extra loop here. I'm not sure why. There we go. So now they're all back flat. Okay. So for the next one, we're going to come underneath and come back up through this hole. What you don't want to do is go on top from hole to hole, because what that does is it puts a lot more thread on the surface, so that when the snap gets opened and closed, that's a lot more thread rubbing against each other, creating more friction, creating more opportunities for your thread to snap. So we travel underneath to the next hole and just repeat the process. And you're going to do that for each hole. You'll do that for each hole on the male snap as well as the female snap. Side. I mean, they're both the snap. All right, travel underneath to the next hole. And repeat. And like I said, if you want to cover the entire expanse of that hole, you can. It does make it more secure and can make it prettier. But the minimum that you need to do is 3 passes. And And what I'm looking for in grading in this is that you have placed the closure on the fabric properly, as in, you know, the part that needs to function is properly oriented. I'm going to be looking for your stitches to be neat. I don't want to see extra loops of thread on the top or on the bottom. Like that. All right. So there's my third pass and my final hole. Now instead of coming up inside, since I need to tie my knot, I'm going to come up right next to that last opening, or that last entrance. Take a little bite to make my loop, pass my needle through and collapse it. Now for snaps, I like to then travel back across to that initial, to that next hole. And do that again, just so I've got a backup knot. Okay, so I've done my knot. Now I'm going to bury the tail and clip. And then for the male side, you're going to do the exact same process. You're just making sure that you have that on there with the snap part up and the flat part against the fabric. All right, so those are your required elements for closures. And on the next video, I'll show you the extra credit options.